What's going on, Dark Files family, and welcome back to another episode that's going to keep you up at night. Before we dive into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're covering cases that will genuinely disturb you. Now imagine this. You're walking through a quiet Iowa town in 1912. White picket fences, children playing in yards, the American dream in full swing. But in one house, just one house on this peaceful street, something so horrific happened that over 110 years later, people still can't explain it. And here's the thing that's going to make your skin crawl. The killer was never caught. This is the story of the Villisca Axe murders, and I'm warning you right now, this case is going to mess with your head. It's June 9th, 1912, in Villisca, Iowa. Population, 2,039. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, doors are left unlocked, and the biggest crime is usually someone's cow wandering into the neighbor's yard. Josiah Moore is 43 years old, a successful businessman who owns a farm implement store. He's married to Sarah, and they have 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, who's just 5 years old. The Moores are what you'd call pillars of the community, church-going, well-respected, living the American dream. That Sunday evening, the Moore family attended the Children's Day service at their Presbyterian church. It was a special event where the kids performed for the whole congregation. Catherine and Boyd Moore were part of the program, and they did such a good job that Sarah Moore invited 2 of Catherine's friends to come home with them for a sleepover. These friends were Ina Stillinger, 8 years old, and her sister Lena, who was 12. Sweet, innocent little girls who were excited about their first sleepover at the Moore house. The family arrived home around 9:45 p.m. Josiah did his usual routine. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and made sure everything was secure. Remember this detail because it's important. By 10 p.m., all 8 people in that house were asleep. But someone or something was watching that house, waiting. The next morning, Monday, June 10th, Josiah Moore doesn't show up to open his store. Now in 1912, if you owned a business, you opened it. There were no sick days, no calling in, you just showed up. When Josiah didn't appear by 8 a.m., his business partner, F.F. Jones, knew something was wrong. Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, had also noticed something odd. The Moore house was completely silent. No children playing, no sounds of morning routines, nothing. The chickens in their yard were going crazy, squawking and carrying on like something had spooked them during the night. At around 8:30 a.m., Mary called out to the house. No response. She tried knocking on the door. Nothing. The curtains were all drawn tight, which was unusual because Sarah Moore always opened them first thing in the morning. Mary tried the door handle. Remember, Josiah had locked up the night before. But now, the door was unlocked. She called out as she stepped inside. "Sarah? Sarah? Are you home?" Silence. Mary walked toward the downstairs guest bedroom where she figured the Stillinger girls had slept. She pushed open the door and, I want you to picture the most horrific scene you can imagine, then multiply it by 10. That's what Mary Peckham saw. 2 small bodies in the bed, covered by a sheet, but the blood was everywhere. On the walls, the ceiling, pooled on the floor, and the smell, a metallic, sickening smell that would haunt Mary for the rest of her life. Mary screamed and ran from the house, but she had the presence of mind to call for help. Within minutes, the entire town seemed to descend on the Moore property. What they found inside that house defied comprehension. All 8 people, the entire Moore family and both Stillinger girls, had been brutally murdered with an axe. But this wasn't just a killing. This was overkill of the most disturbing kind. Josiah Moore had been struck at least 30 times with the axe. Sarah had been hit over 20 times. The children had been beaten so savagely that they were barely recognizable. But here's where this case gets truly bizarre. The killer didn't just murder these people and leave. Oh no. They did something far more sinister. After the murders, the killer stayed in the house. They covered every mirror with cloth. They covered all the windows so no light could get in. They placed a slab of bacon next to the murder weapon, an axe that actually belonged to Josiah Moore, taken from his own woodshed. The killer left water bowls around the house as if they had tried to clean themselves. But perhaps most disturbing of all, there were signs that someone had cooked and eaten food from the Moore's kitchen after the murders. Let that sink in. This person killed 8 people, including 4 children, then made themselves comfortable enough to cook a meal. The investigation began immediately, but this was 1912. There was no DNA testing, no fingerprinting techniques, no forensic science as we know it today. What they had was a crime scene that had been contaminated by dozens of townspeople who had wandered through before it could be secured. The coroner determined that all the victims had been killed between midnight and 5 a.m. The killer had used the blunt end of the axe, not the sharp blade, meaning these people didn't die quickly. This was prolonged, brutal, and personal. Detectives found that Josiah and Sarah Moore had been killed first, likely as they slept. The killer then moved methodically through the house, killing each child one by one. The Stillinger girls were last, but here's a detail that's going to give you nightmares. Lena Stillinger, the 12-year-old, appeared to have defensive wounds. She had tried to fight back. This little girl woke up, realized what was happening, and tried to defend herself against the killer with an axe. The positioning of the bodies suggested that someone had moved them after death, arranging them in specific ways. The killer had taken time to pose these victims. So who would do something like this? The investigation quickly focused on several suspects, and each one was more disturbing than the last. Suspect number 1, Reverend George Kelly. Yes, a reverend. Kelly had been in Villisca the night of the murders, had attended the same church service as the Moore family, and had left town on the early morning train, just hours after the estimated time of death. When police tracked him down, Kelly's behavior was odd. He seemed to know details about the crime scene that hadn't been released to the public. During questioning, he would go into these strange trances, speaking in different voices, claiming that God had told him to cleanse the earth of sinners. Kelly was actually tried twice for the murders. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial acquitted him, but many people in Villisca remained convinced he was guilty. Suspect number 2, Frank Jones. Remember F.F. Jones, Josiah's business partner? Well, Frank Jones was F.F.'s brother, and he had a serious grudge against Josiah Moore. See, Frank and Josiah had been business partners years earlier, but Josiah had left to start his own competing store. Frank felt betrayed and had made threats against Josiah. Frank had an alibi. He was supposedly out of town, but some witnesses claimed to have seen him in Villisca that night. Even more suspicious, Frank seemed to have inside knowledge about the crime and showed no emotion when discussing the brutal murders of an entire family. But the most terrifying suspect was William Mansfield, also known as Blackie Mansfield. This man was a drifter, a career criminal who had been in the area around the time of the murders. What made Mansfield particularly frightening was that he fit the profile of similar axe murders that had been happening across the Midwest. Between 1908 and 1912, there were at least 12 other axe murders in Kansas, Missouri, Colorado, and Iowa that shared disturbing similarities with Villisca. Entire families killed in their sleep, always with an axe, always with evidence that the killer had stayed in the house afterward. Mansfield was eventually convicted of one of these other axe murders and spent years in prison. But he was never charged with Villisca, despite many investigators believing he was responsible for multiple family massacres across the region. Here's where this case gets even stranger. In the days following the murders, Villisca was overrun with curiosity seekers, reporters, and self-proclaimed detectives. The crime scene was so poorly managed that people were taking souvenirs, pieces of blood-stained wood, fragments of evidence, even parts of the murder weapon. The house became a macabre tourist attraction. People would pay to tour the crime scene, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bloodstains or feel the presence of evil that still seemed to linger in those rooms. But visitors reported something unsettling. Many people claimed to feel an overwhelming sense of dread in the house. Some said they heard whispers, saw shadows moving, or felt suddenly nauseated. Skeptics dismissed this as suggestion and imagination, but the reports were consistent and came from people who didn't believe in the paranormal. One visitor in 1912, just months after the murders, wrote, "There is something still in that house, something that feeds on what happened there." The case officially went cold, but the impact on Villisca was devastating. Property values plummeted, families moved away. The sense of safety and community that had defined this small town was shattered forever. Children who had been friends with the Moore kids grew up traumatized. Adults who had known the family struggled with survivor's guilt and paranoia. The entire town had to live with the knowledge that a killer had walked among them, had possibly attended church with them, had smiled and shaken their hands while planning mass murder, and they had to live with the fact that this killer was never caught. He could be anywhere. He could strike again. In fact, the similarities between Villisca and those other axe murders suggest that he probably did strike again. Multiple families, multiple towns, all living in fear of the Axeman, a killer who seemed to appear out of nowhere, destroy entire families, and vanish back into the darkness. The Moore House still stands today in Villisca, Iowa. It's been turned into a museum, and believe it or not, you can actually stay overnight in the house where 8 people were brutally murdered. People come from all over the world to spend the night in those rooms, sleeping in the same beds where the Moore family drew their last breaths. Guests consistently report paranormal activity, voices, footsteps, doors slamming, and that same overwhelming feeling of dread that visitors described over 100 years ago. Some people have fled the house in the middle of the night, too terrified to stay until morning. But here's what really keeps me up at night about this case. In 1912, Villisca had a population of just over 2,000 people. The killer knew that house, knew the family's routine, knew how to get in and out without being seen. This wasn't a random crime. It was planned, methodical, and personal, which means one of two things happened. Either a stranger had been watching the Moore family for weeks or months, learning their habits, waiting for the perfect opportunity, or the killer was someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who had been in their home before, who knew the layout, who knew that Josiah would lock up at night and check the windows. Think about that. On June 9th, 1912, the Moore family went to church. They sang hymns, they prayed, they watched their children perform in the program. They invited 2 little girls over for what should have been a fun sleepover. They went to bed feeling safe, surrounded by love in a town where everybody knew everybody. And somewhere in that church congregation, or walking those same streets, or maybe even sitting in their neighbors' houses, was a person planning to kill them all. A person who would take an axe and methodically murder 8 innocent people, including 4 children under the age of 12. That person was never caught. They lived their entire life knowing what they had done, and they took that secret to their grave. So what do you think happened in Villisca? Was it the Reverend, driven to madness by religious mania? Was it a business rival settling an old score in the most horrific way possible? Or was it something worse? A serial killer who roamed the Midwest, leaving destroyed families and traumatized communities in his wake? The truth is, we'll never know. But the Villisca axe murders remain one of America's most disturbing unsolved crimes, a reminder that sometimes evil walks among us, undetected and unpunished. And sometimes, that evil leaves behind more than just bodies. It leaves behind a darkness that never fully goes away. That's all for today's episode of Dark Files. If this case disturbed you as much as it disturbed me, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments which suspect you think was responsible. And remember, there are monsters in this world. Some of them might even live next door. Until next time, stay safe out there. You never know who might be watching,